We'll say a lot to do today. All right, good morning. Today's daf is Ayin. We left off on Samech Tes Amud Beis of the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Imosai, maybe Chagiga Imam. We'll say, now again, remember, on Yom Tov, there's also the concept on our Erev Yom Tov, we're going to see of Karban Chagiga. So Karban Chagiga was a Shlamim Karban, so you gave part of it up on the Mizbeach, and the owners ate a lot of it as well. So the Gemara says, Imosai maybe Chagiga. When do you go ahead and bring a Karban Chagiga? Bizman Shuhuba Bichol, Bitara Ubemuat. When they go ahead and you bring the Karban Bichol during the week, Bitara, when people are tahar, ubemuat. And Rabbi say muat means what? When there's not enough Karban Pesach for the group to go ahead and become full. Also, remember, we've seen already that Lamaisa, all you need to do for the Karban Pesach is everybody needs to eat a kizayis, which means that you could have had a situation where you have a very large group. Very, very large group, everyone might just be getting a very small piece of Karban Pesach. If that's the case, Mamish, remember, it's still got to eat, right? We're Jewish. It's still the meal. So what do? You supplement the meal with a Karban Shlamim. So these are the three criteria for bringing a Karban Chagiga. Number one, it's got to be, you can't bring a Karban Chagiga on Shabbos, meaning if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, you can't slaughter it on Shabbos. Number two, as opposed to Karban Pesach, which can be brought even if everybody's tamei, right? Karban Chagiga can only be brought if people are tahar. And number three, you really only bring it if you need it, i.e. that there's not enough Karban Pesach to actually satiate people. Ubizman shehu, Ubizman shehu ba b'Shabbos b'meruba b'tuma in Ravina imo Chagiga. But, and we'll see why the Mishnah has to phrase it this way, but if it's Erev Pesach is Shabbos, or there's a lot of Karban Pesach meat for everybody, it's a small chabura, so everybody has a lot to eat from the animal, or everybody is tamei, in those cases, you don't bring a Karban Chagiga with the Karban Pesach. Chagiga haisaba minat son, minat bakar, minat kbasa, minat izah, minat zchar, minat kebos. So Karban Chagiga can be brought. I will say son in this case actually means from the flock. We'll see exactly what that's coming to convey to us. Bakar, cattle, kivasim, sheep, izim, goats, zucharim, the kevos, male animals, female animals, v'ne'echeles l'shnei yomim v'layla echad. And it can be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. Obviously, a longer duration than Karban Pesach as well. Says the Gemara, "My Tana diktani Chagiga." Why are we talking about Karban Chagiga over here? I mean, we're still in the middle of Karban Pesach, so why are we talking about Karban Chagiga? To which the Gemara says, "Oh, I'll tell you why. Tana har kavasa v'hava aso delodochi Shabbos." Because remember, the Tana in the previous Mishnah discussed the things that are not docha Shabbos. So or that are and that are not. So among the things that are not docha Shabbos, har kavaso is ultimately again bringing the animal. Right, let's say putting the animal on your shoulders. V'hava also are leading it. So therefore, v'katani nami chagiga d'lo Shabbos. Once the Mishnah spoke about the things that are not docha Shabbos on Erev Pesach Shabbos, it also brought down chagiga, which is also not docha Shabbos. V'achi kamar. This is what it means to say emasay mavin imo chagiga. When do we bring a Karban Chagiga? Bizman shuba b'chol b'tara u'b'muat. Therefore, Rabbi says, so once we open the discussion about Lamaisa, when we bring Karban, what things you can't do on Shabbos, so therefore the Mishnah also chooses to include a discussion about Chagiga, which also can't be done on Shabbos. Amar Rashi shmamina Chagigas arba asar tapavayin lav chovehi. What do you see from here? That apparently bringing the Chagiga on the 14th is not obligatory. Is not obligatory. Because if you would think that it's obligatory, teisei b'Shabbos, then what? Then you should bring it on Shabbos. V'teisei b'meruba, and you should bring it even if there is enough Karban Pesach meat for everyone. V'teisei b'tuma, and it should be brought even if the kehila is tamei, just like Karban Pesach. So the point the Gemara is making over here, the fact that it's not brought under these circumstances indicates that what? That it's discretionary, it's not obligatory. So the Gemara says, and by the way, ubemiut, mihu my time asya. Why is it that if there's not enough Karban Pesach meat, right, which means again, I will say if everybody's only getting a small amount, why is it that we bring the Karban Chagiga? To which the Gemara says, Kidisanya, as the Brisa writes, Chagiga haboima Pesach ne'echeles tchila kedei Pesach ne'echal ala sovar. We'll say we'll discuss this later on, but there is a concept of Pesach ne'echal ala sovar, which means that Karban Pesach is supposed to be consumed in a state of satiety. Now, obviously, not supposed to be really full, but the idea is, when you're very hungry, so often you don't take the time to really relish the item that you're eating, but you eat it quickly because you're hungry. The idea Korban Pesach is supposed to be savored. So the concept of Ne'achal min asova means that we want you to be somewhat sated at the time when you get to the Korban Pesach, so that when you eat the Korban Pesach, you'll eat it slowly and you'll enjoy it. So the Gemara says, therefore, in a situation,
make it less important?
No, actually, because a person takes the time to relish it, right? When you're starving and you scarf something down, that food doesn't have a chashivos. That's. I'm sorry. It also keeps you from breaking the bone, 100%. So we'll say the point the Gemara is making over here again. If there's enough Korban Pesach meat for every person to have a meal, then that's what you eat. But if there's not enough Korban Pesach meat, then Lemaisa, we don't want you to start with the Korban Pesach meat because again, so what do? We bring the chagiga. You eat a little bit or a lot of chagiga, depending how much you want to eat, and you save room for the Korban Pesach at the end. So the Gemara goes weiter. And remember the Korban chagiga. So now the Mishnah afterwards said that the Korban chagiga can come from all these various animals, can male, female, and is consumed for 2 days and 1 night. So the Gemara says, Masnisin de ke ben tema. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of ben tema. Why? Disanya ben tema or ben tema said, Chagiga habayim pesach harihi ke pesach. Well, so Ben Tema has an amazing shita, and we'll see why. Ben Tema says that the chagiga that comes with the Korban Pesach is like the Korban Pesach. It has all the same laws as the Korban Pesach. Ve'ena ne'acheles ela liyom u'velayla, and is only consumed for 1 day and 1 night. The chagigas chamisha asar ne'acheles lishnei yamim velayla echad. Yet, if you bring a chagiga on the 15th, the first day of Yom Tov, then what? That's consumed for 2 days and 1 night. So interesting, what Ben Tema is saying is like this. The Korban Chagiga brought on the 14th with the Korban Pesach is given the same status and the same laws as the Korban Pesach. But yet the Korban Chagiga brought, also remember, why would somebody bring a Korban Chagiga on the 15th? Because remember, again, you brought a Korban Chagiga for meat purposes, right? You want to eat. So that's what you would do. You bring the Korban, the sacrificial parts of God on the Mizbeach, and you would have meat for Yontiv. So the Korban Chagiga that's brought on the 15th, i.e. first day of Pesach, that has the din of a regular shlamim, and that's consumed for 2 days and 1 night. The Chagigas arba asar, Yotze ba mishum simcha, ve'ein yotzim ba mishum chagiga. And interestingly enough, with the Korban chagiga on the 14th, now Rashi points out over here, yotzim ba mishum simcha, Rashi says, im ikva ad lemachar, v'shachta, yotze ba mishum simcha, mishum shalmei simcha. Af agav shemufreshes va'omedes ikvar, v'shalmei simcha chovehi. I suppose this is interesting. So yet, if you took the chagiga that you separated out on the 14th, but you didn't go ahead and offer it up until the 15th, you would be yotze because of simcha. Simcha means on Yom Tov there's an obligation to offer shalmei simcha. However, you would not be yotze because of chagiga. Rashi says ve'en yotze ba mishum chagigas chamisha asar kida amran davar sheyesh bo chova. Rabbi said there's an obligation. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. There are different obligations over the course of Yom Tov. There's something called Shalmei Simcha. Shalmei Simcha means you have an obligation to bring certain shlamim offerings over the course of Yom Tov. So if you separated the animal on the 14th, and initially you were going to give it to on the 14th, but now you went ahead and you gave it on the 15th, that would satisfy your criteria for Shalmei Simcha, but it would not satisfy the criteria for Chagiga, for Korban Chagiga of the 15th. Because Korban Chagiga of the 15th has to come from an animal that was not designated for any other purpose. Since this technically was designated as the Korban on the 14th, therefore it doesn't satisfy your criteria for the 15th. So the Gemara says, fine, my time with the Ben Tema. So what's Ben Tema's logic? Because you also remember, Ben Tema is arguing with our Mishnah. And Ben Tema says that the Chagiga of the 14th has the same laws as the Korban Pesach. So where does Ben Tema get this from? Kedemasni Rav Lechia Berei. As Rav taught Chia his son, what does the pasuk say? Velo yolin laboker. Velo yolin laboker zevach chag haPesach. What does the pasuk say? You will not leave over to the morning zevach chag haPesach. Literally, the offering of the Pesach holiday. So the Gemara says something very interesting, or Ben Tema says something very interesting. Zevach chag, what is the offering of the holiday? Ze chagiga. That refers to Korban chagiga. HaPesach kemashma'o. V'amarachmana v'lo yolin. So we'll say very interesting drasha. So Ben Tema says, the pasuk has an extra phrase. Pasuk could have just said, v'lo yolin leboker HaPesach. But it doesn't say that. Instead, it says, V'lo yon lebok, you shouldn't leave over to the morning. Zevach chag ha-Pesach. So Ben Tema says that Pesach is the Pesach offering, and Zevach chag, the offering of the Yom Tov, refers to the Karban Chagiga. And what does that show you? That at least in this pasuk, the Karban Chagiga has the same restrictions of lina, of being left over. The Karban Chagiga has the same restrictions of lina, of leaving over until the morning, as Karban Pesach does. So now the Gemara asks, Ibar lohu leben Tema. So now we have to ask according to Ben Tema, ne'echeles tzli, or ein ne'echeles tzli. So now the question is, now what you've established is that Karban Chagiga shares a certain commonality with Karban Pesach, namely that it may not be left over until the next morning. So now the shaila is, how far does that connection between these two karbanos go? For example, when it comes to the Karban Pesach, we know that lemaisa, it can only be eaten roasted. So what about the Karban Chagiga? Is that also only eaten roasted? Again, I will say, to be clear, we're only referring now to the Karban Chagiga of the 14th. The Karban Chagiga, I'm sorry? According to Ben Tema, the Karban Chagiga of the rest of Yom Tov, even Ben Tema is not suggesting that that's like Karban Pesach. But the shayla is for the one of the 14, so does it have to be eaten roasted or not? So ki akshi rachmana lePesach lelina avalet tzlilo. So when the Torah compares the Karban Chagiga to Karban Pesach, is it just for lina, leftover purposes that you can't leave it over to the next morning? Dilma loshna. Or maybe no, once we create the comparison and the connection between Karban Pesach and Karban Chagiga, maybe then all of the halachos of Pesach are applied to Chagiga as well. Tashma, so we'll say, listen to this, what does the Gemara do? The Gemara quotes from the 10th parak, Halayla hazeh kulo tzli. Right, so where is this from? This is from the Manishtana. Right, so again, the Mishnah, this is from the Mishnah in the 10th parak of Pesachim. So it discusses that one of the intriguing distinctions of the night of Pesach is that all the meat that we eat is tzli. Now, if it's saying all of the meat that we eat, that indicates that what? That even the Karban Chagiga is eaten only roasted as well. V'amar Rav Chisda zu divrei Ben Tema. And Rav Chisda said, these are the words of Ben Tema. Look at this. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says, "Shmamina." So what do we see from here? We see here that according to Ben Tema, we'll say again, it's all according to Ben Tema. So according to Ben Tema, who lemaisa again links the Karban Chagiga with the Karban Pesach, explains that this applies even to the fact that Karban Chagiga must be eaten roasted. We don't pass like Ben Tema. We pass like the Mishnah. We pass like the Mishnah, so that the Karban Chagiga is not governed by the laws of Pesach.
Yeah. There's nothing that we use. That reminds us of Chagiga on Pesach night?
The Beitzah. The Beitzah is there. Yep.
So you go as far as say it's Docha Shabbos?
No, we passed. No, Ben Tema was the only one who was passing that it's Docha Shabbos. We were passing that it's not Docha Shabbos.
He would say it is Docha Shabbos.
Ben Tema says it is Docha Shabbos. It's just like the Pesach. Just like the Pesach, absolutely. So the Gemara says, "Yibayluhu leben tema ba min abakar o ina ba min abakar ba min anakevos o ina ba min anakevos ba bas shtei shalom o ina ba bas shtei shalom." So we'll say now the Gemara asks, according to Ben Tema, who now has established that the Karban Chagiga is like the Karban Pesach. Number one in terms of lina, number two in terms of tzli. So can we extend this? This Karban Chagiga, can it come from cattle, or doesn't it come from cattle or from cows? Can it come from female animals, or not from female animals? Can it come from a sheep or from a goat that's 2 years old or more, or not? Now, both said these are all things that would not be kosher for Karban Pesach. So the shaila is now: do you have to use the same type of animal for Chagiga as you do for Pesach? And the shaila is ki akshi rachman lePesach lemidi de'achila aval lechol mililo. So when we say that the Torah compares Chagiga to Pesach, is that just in the manner in which it's consumed? But for all other things, i.e. the type of animal, the Torah does not make the comparison, or maybe not. Maybe the comparison is across the board. And whatever is true for Pesach will be true for Chagiga as well. Tashma, therefore the Gemara quotes the Brisa, Chagiga habayim Pesach, the Chagiga that's brought together with the Pesach on the 14th, harihi ke Pesach. It is ultimately just like the Karban Pesach. Ba'a minat son, it must come from sheep. Ve'ina ba'a minat bakar, and it can't come from cattle. Ba'a minat schorim, it has to be a male animal. Ve'in ba'a minat nekevos, it can't be a female animal. Ba'a bas shnasa, it must be an animal within its first year. Ve'ina ba'a bas shtei shanim, and it can't be an animal that's over a year old. Shtei shanim means into its second year. Ve'ina ne'acheles ela liyom echad. V'layla, and it's only consumed for 1 day and 1 night. Ve'ina ne'acheles ela ne'echala tzli. It can only be eaten roasted. Ve'eno ne'echalas ela lemenuyav. And it can only be eaten for who? For the people who are counted as part of its group prior to its slaughtering. Man sham islay di islay hai svara. So who is the opinion who espouses all of these ideas? So the Gemara says, Ben Tema, Shmamina, Kulhu milsa ba'ina shmamina. So we see from here clearly and conclusively that when Ben Tema links the carbon chagiga to the carbon pesach, he clearly does it in what? In all areas. So now the Gemara asks one more question. Ibailu le Ben Tema, yesh ba mishum shviras etzem, o ein ba mishum shviras etzem. So what's another shayla? We know that one of the interesting halachas when it comes to carbon pesach, Torah says ve'etzem lo sishberu bo. You're not permitted to break a bone of the carbon pesach when eating the pesach. So the shaila is, does that obligation or prohibition of shviras etzem apply to the chagiga or not? So the Gemara says, Af agav dechi akshi rachmana lepesach, Amar kra, bo v'lo b'chagiga. So we'll say, on one hand, you could say that even though we've established that the Torah compares the chagiga to the Karban Pesach, the Torah used lashon of etzem lo sishperu bo. Torah goes out to say you shall not break a bone in it. Maybe it, bo, is an exclusionary phrase, that it only applies to Karban Pesach and nothing else. Bo v'lo b'chagiga. Old Dilma, hi bo, or maybe bo comes to teach us what? B'kasher v'lo b'pasel hu da'asa. Maybe the bo comes to teach us that the prohibition of breaking the bone is only in a Karban Pesach that is kosher, but not in a Karban Pesach that is pasel. Tashma. So we'll say this, the Gemara resolves this in a fascinating way. So the Gemara says, Tashma, sakin shenimtzeis ba'ar basar, shochid b'miyad. We'll say, let's say you find the knife on the 14th. You find a knife, a shechita knife, lying around on the 14th, and now you want to use it ultimately to shecht your animal. So what's the halacha? So the halacha is, if you find it on the 14th, you could use it immediately. Now, the Gemara is referring to over here is, do you have to be choshesh that the knife might be tameh? So the Gemara is saying essentially on the 14th, we're pretty sure that by now everybody has toveled their kalim, who needs to tovel their kalim, and therefore the Maisa we assume that the knife is tahar. B'shlosha asar, however, again, if you find the knife on the 13th, then shona umatbil. Then you must go ahead and immerse it in a mikveh again, out of a concern that it may be tameh. I will say, why is the 13th different than the 14th? Because the 14th is game day, right? I'm saying you got to shecht on that day. The 13th, people still have time. Because remember, Rose, if let's say right now you could be talking about a knife that, let's say, has a more minor form of tumah, like sheretz tumah. So remember, how do you deal with sheretz tumah? Sheretz tumah is 1 day tumah. So all you need to do is you need to take it to the mikvah sometime during the day, and that evening the item becomes tar. So if somebody had a knife that had sheretz tumah, the truth is there was, by the 14th it had to be tar, but there was no rush. They could easily just take it to the mikvah on the 13th, and the Maisa by nightfall it'll be tar. So therefore, if you find the knife on the 13th, you can't assume that the owner had toveled it already, and therefore if you want to use it, you have to go ahead and tovel it again. We'll say we're leaving aside right now. There's an interesting choshen mishpat discussion. In general, when you find something about the permissibility of using it, so it could just be that there was a general sense of mechila, that since there are so many people in Yerushalayim and inevitably stuff gets lost, that people were okay with other people using their stuff. Okay, but we're not getting into that right now. So the Gemara says, kofitz. And I'll say, what's a kofitz? So the truth is, the way kofitz is often translated is as a meat cleaver. So I don't know what a meat cleaver is exactly, but I'll tell you how Rashi describes it. Rashi says it's a large knife. It's a large knife. Now, this was the type of knife that you would use, big blade, that you would also use to cut through bone. So, for example, when you had a carbon, you were cutting stuff up. You needed to go and be able to. So a knife would not cut through bone. A knife was used for shechita or knife, but the cleaver was used to cut through bone. So the Gemara says, what if you find a meat cleaver, kofitz, bein bazeh shono umatbil. Either way, whether you find the cleaver on the 13th or the 14th, you have to tovel it again. So the Gemara says money. So whose opinion does this reflect? Ilema Rabbanan, if you want to say it's the rabbis, Maishna Sakin de Matbil de Chazi le Pesach, Kofitz Namia Chazi de Chagiga. And Rabbi, here's the interesting part. So apparently, what the Bryce seems to be saying is like this. If you find the meat cleaver even on the 14th, so then Lamaisa, you have to tovel it again if you want to use it. Why? Because we assume it wasn't tar. Now, I will say, why do we assume it wasn't tar? That means why? Why is it not tar? Because we assume the owner didn't tovel it. Why didn't the owner tovel it? because apparently he doesn't need it. So the Gemara says, well, let's analyze this. Why wouldn't you need your meat cleaver on the 14th? If it's according to the Rabbanon, also remember, the Rabbanon do not equate the Chagiga with the Pesach, in which case you would still need your cleaver, your large knife. Why? To break apart the Chagiga. However, Elalav the Ben Temahu. Rather, this brisa must reflect the view of Ben Tema. Ben Tema equates the Chagiga to Karban Pesach, and apparently Ben Tema even equates the Karban Pesach to Chagiga to say that what? That just like you can't break a bone in the Karban Pesach, so too you can't break a bone in the Chagiga, and therefore, again, the meat cleaver would be unnecessary, and therefore, if you find it, even on the 14th, you can't assume that the owners immersed it, and you would have to tovel it again prior to using it. So the Gemara says, to which the Gemara says, "Lo, maybe not. The olam rabbanon. It could be even the rabbis, right? And therefore, again, what that would be now, if we say it's the rabbis don't equate chagiga to Pesach in all respects. Therefore, again, you would want your meat cleaver for the 14th because you would use it to go ahead and cut apart your chagiga. So if it's according to the rabbanon, then why is it that if you find a meat cleaver on the 14th, why would we not assume that l'maisa it's tar because the owners told it the previous day? To which the Gemara says, "Ukigon sheba b'Shabbos." Because what's the case of the brisa? The case of the brisa is where Erev Pesach is Shabbos. I will say, what happens when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos? That's our Mishnah. We don't bring the Chagiga. So because we don't bring the Chagiga, the owner would not have been quick. The owner would not have necessarily gone ahead and made sure to tov the meat cleaver prior to Yom Tov. So the Gemara says, but 1 second. B'hamid iktani seifa chal arba'as ralios b'Shabbos. I will say the end of that brisa explicitly says that if Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, shochid ba miyad, you shecht immediately. So shochid miyad, you could go ahead and use it to shecht immediately, and on the 15th you use it to shecht immediately. Nimtseis kofitz kshur l'sakin harihi kisakin. Furthermore, the brisa says that if you find the meat cleaver attached to the knife, then whatever the status of the knife, the meat cleaver has the same status. I will say we don't care about those cases right now, but what we do focus on is what is the fact michlal dereisha lab b'Shabbos askina. So I will say the fact that the seifa goes out of its way to say, and if there's a case where Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos, indicates to us what? That the reisha of the brisa is not dealing with Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbos. If the reisha is not talking about Erev Pesach that falls on Shabbos, then we still have a problem, which is that according to the Rabbanon, if you want to see the brisa like the Rabbanon, then why would you not assume that the meat cleaver has a chazaka of being tar prior to already on Erev Yom Tov? To which the Gemara says, Ve'ela sheba b'meruba. Oh, what's the case over here, Abosai? The case where they were talking about is that Lemaisa, the Karban Pesach that was brought by a very small group. And therefore, again, there's plenty of Karban Pesach meat for everyone. If there's plenty of Karban Pesach meat, then what don't you need? You don't need a Karban Chagiga. If you don't need a Karban Chagiga, then what? Then Lemaisa, you don't need the meat cleaver. Okay, to which the Gemara says, "Ve'ela," but mina yadi. So the Gemara says, "Well, how do you know that it's a small group?" Well, so what does that mean? So you have to understand something very interesting. Is that there were actually we'll see this later on in the Gemara, but groups formed for the Karban Pesach until mamish the very end. When I say the very end, until the time of the Shechita, until midday on Erev Pesach. And in fact, interestingly enough, we often think about this idea that, who would you have Karban Pesach with? You'd have your family. But very often what happened is, especially on the morning of Erev Pesach, so those who had extra Karban Pesach, those who realized they would have extra meat, would go around in the marketplace asking perhaps others who were poor or indigent or just didn't have a place, do you need to be part of a chabura? So very often you'd have people a part of your chabura who you did not know, right? So he was not your friends and not your family. So what the Gemara is saying is, you don't really know the size of your chabura until when? Until mamish the shas shchita. So how do you know that it's a small chabura? Ve'ela, rather, it must be sheba b'tumah. We must be talking about a case of a Karban Pesach that was being brought in a state of tumah, right? It must be that the Jewish people the majority of the Jewish people are tamei. Karban Pesach is still brought, but remember, as we said in the Mishnah, in that case where there's a tumah b'tzibor, although the Pesach is brought, the Chagiga is what? The Chagiga is not. So because the Chagiga is not, you don't need a meat cleaver. If you don't need the meat cleaver, that's why if you find it even on the 14th, you can't assume that it's tahor. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, let's understand this for just a moment. Sof, mina yadi. But at the end of the day, the Gemara says, How do you know? How do you see? What I was asking is like this: people would be toveling their kalim on the 13th. On the 13th. Now, so the shaila is about say, if we're dealing with more of a sudden tumah circumstance, then how do you know on the 13th that the Karban Pesach is going to be brought in a state of tumah that you wouldn't go and now see? You could answer this simply by saying, well, I don't know, maybe some. Let me say it differently. Where you're going to have a case of tumah b'tzibur that you know about ahead of time. That's the Gemara is really asking. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you where. Demis nasi. Where the Nasi died. Now I will say, who's the Nasi? Rashi says over here, Nasi u'mitzvah l'chol Yisrael is asekbal. The Nasi is the head of the Jewish people. Remember, in the aftermath of, or not in the aftermath, but after the cessation of the Jewish monarchy, there was something called the Nasi, and the Nasi was the spiritual leader and also the political leader of the Jewish people. When the Nasi dies, everyone is obligated to go to his levaya. So So we often think about this. There are two times pretty much where you would have a national state of tumah. One of them is during war. Where armies are out killing, people are being killed, the enemy is there, corpses, so war. And if the Nasi dies, because if the Nasi dies, everyone is obligated to go to his levaya. So the Gemara says, what's the case of the Brisa? The case of the Brisa is where the Nasi dies. So the Gemara says, okay, let's analyze this. Demis Nasi, emas. When did the Nasi die? Ilema demis b'shlosh asar. If he died on the 13th, Sakin lamali demitpale. So we'll say, remember, if you died on the 13th, then what? Then people aren't going to bother to even tovel their knives either. Why? Because it's clear already that if he dies on the 13th, the Karban Pesach is going to be offered in a state of ritual impurity of Tumah. Therefore, there's no need to tovel your knife on the 13th. Yet, remember again, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa said that if you find the knife on the 14th, we assume it's been toveled on the 13th. So why would that be? Ella, the misba arbas. Or rather, it must be that when did the Nasi die? The Nasi died on Erev Pesach. On Erev Pesach. Maishna sakin de matbil, umaishna kofetz de lo matbil. So this is interesting. So then why is it that Lemaisa, a person would have toveled the knife on the 13th, but yet again, we don't assume that the kofetz would have been toveled? So the Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says, it's low, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. Maishna sakin de matbil, umaishna kofetz de lo matbil, lo tzri. Did I skip a line? Excuse me. And ultimately, the Nasi dies on the Masri that again. Nasi dies on the 14th. Just get my place marker here. Umayshna kofetz, umayshna sakin de mitbal, umayshna kofetz de lo mitbal. Right, to both sides. So if the Nasi died, then again, same question. Why are you toveling anything? Let me say again, everything's being done in a ritual state of impurity. To which the Gemara is something very interesting. Lo tzricha. The Nasi goses b'shlosh asar. I will say, listen to this interesting case. The Nasi didn't die, but the Nasi is a goses. What does that mean? The Nasi is gonna die imminently. He's going to die. So everybody knows the Nasi is gonna die imminently. So we'll say, listen to this. People are very practical. So what happens? So the Gemara says, so Nasi goses b'shlosh asar. Sakin dechad svega matbila. So we'll say so now it's the 13th. The Nasi is a goses. I have to figure out for myself, what am I going to schlep to the mikvah and what am I not going to schlep to the mikvah? So the Gemara says, in this circumstance, a person will take the knife to the mikvah. Why? Because there's only one suffix. There's only one suffix. Now, what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Sakin dechad sveikahu, de'ika lemeimar shema yomos hanasi, v'ya'asu pesach betuma. Mishum hach sveika lo imna me'ela atbula, v'atbula, dechai yishom yomos yasa pesach betara. So, when I come to the mikvah on the 13th, so the Maisi again, when it comes to the knife, there's one suffix. What's the suffix? The suffix is if I'm going to need it or not, because if the Nasi dies today or tomorrow, then the Pesach is going to be done b'tumah, and therefore there's not going to be a need for a tar knife. So essentially, in order to keep but the Nasi might not die just because he's a goses now. He might die on the first day of Pesach and not tomorrow. So therefore, he'll tovel the knife. Kolfitz the trey sveki lo mitpala. But also when it comes to the meat cleaver, and there are two sveikos, therefore the Maisa, a person will not go ahead and tovel. And I will say, what are the two sveikos when it comes to the kofetz? Look at Rashi. So Rashi says, "Val kofetz the trei sveiki islay misalki le mitoras tvila shema yamos," and also Shetei chaburasi mu'etes. So I will say when you come to the meat cleaver, there are two sveikos. Suffix number one is that maybe the nasi is going to die. If the nasi is going to die, I don't have to tovel the meat cleaver. What's suffix number two? Suffix number two is maybe I'm going to have a small chabura. And if I have a small chabura, then what? Then the mais again, I don't need a carbon chagiga, and therefore I won't need the meat cleaver. So therefore, it's a very interesting interpretation. So the Gemara is suggesting that although again at the outset the brisa works perfectly with bentema, because bentema holds that a chagiga is just like Pesach, and therefore there is no breaking of bones even in the chagiga, and therefore again a kofetz, a meat cleaver, does not have a cheskas tara because the owners don't really need it for erev Pesach. But now the Gemara is suggesting it could even work out according to the Rabbanon in a very specific case, where what? The nasi is a goses on the 13th. So therefore now, when I have to schlep my kelim to the mikvah to go ahead and tovel it, so here's my cheshbon. I'm going to tovel my knife because I may need it, because the nasi may die, the nasi may not. The kofetz, I'm not going to schlep to the mikvah to tovel it. You know why? Too many ifs, because the nasi may die, and therefore again we're all going to be b'tumah. And even if he doesn't die, it could be that my chabura is going to be small and I won't need a chagiga at all. Therefore, lemaisa, we can't assume that the kofetz was automatically tovelled on the 13th, and therefore if you find it, you would have to go ahead and retovel it. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tanya, Yehuda ben Dortai is a very interesting Gemara. Yehuda ben Dortai, Perish, who v'Dortai beno, v'halach v'yashav lo b'daram. So we'll say it's fascinating. So Yehuda ben Dortai and his son Dartai. So his father was Dartai, named his son Dartai. They went ahead and they separated themselves from the rest of the sages, the rest of the Chachamim, and they went to live in the south of Eretz Yisrael. Now, why? What happened? Amar, listen to this. This is fascinating. Im yavo Eliyahu, because he said, "Here's what I'm concerned about. Eliyahu is going to come. V'yomer lahem liYisrael mipnei ma lo chagagtem chagiga b'Shabbos." So Eliyahu is going to come and he's going to call us out. He's going to say, "Why did you not bring the carbon chagiga on Shabbos?" And what's going to happen? Mahin omrim lo. What are we going to say to him? Timhani ashne gedoli hadar shmaya va'avtalyon. The question that was really at the two great leaders of our generation, Shmaya and Avtalyon, shin chachamim gedolim, v'darshanim gedolim. They're great chachamim, great expositors of the law. And yet they never paskined that chagigas docha Shabbos. So Rabbi say, interestingly enough, so Ben Dartai apparently felt that Yehuda Ben Dartai apparently felt that, like Ben Tema, that there is an obligation to go ahead and bring carbon chagiga on Shabbos, and he was so convinced that he was right. He obviously wasn't going to publicly disagree with the sages, but what did he do? He went ahead and he resettled all the way in the south. Now, what does that do for him? So Rabbi say, listen to this. Look at Rashi for just a moment. So Rashi said, "V'yashav lo b'daram." It's the last couple of short lines in Rashi. Rachok miYerushalayim. What did he do? He purposely distanced himself far away from Yerushalayim in order v'yis shelo la'alos l'regel v'yis chayiv b'pesach u'b'chagiga d'kasavar chagiga chova va'afilu b'meruba. So Rabbi say, here's what's interesting. So Yehuda ben Dartai felt that carbon chagiga is an obligation at all times. It's an obligation on Shabbos. It's an obligation even b'meruba. So what does he do? He goes ahead and he parks himself. He relocates far, far away. In order that he has the status of derech rechoka. He's too far. What happens if a person is derech rechoka on Pesach? They don't have to bring the carbon Pesach. They have to come for Pesach Sheni. See, he put himself in the category of derech rechoka because he felt otherwise he'd be in a difficult circumstance because he was not going to go against, obviously, Shmai and Avtalyon, but at the same time, personally, he felt that there was an obligation to bring chagiga under all circumstances. So the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, "My time with the Ben Dortai." What was Ben Dortai's logic? Dichsiv v'zavachta Pesach laHashem Elokecha tzon ubakar, because the Torah says you will bring a Pesach for Hashem your God. Tzon ubakar v'halo ein Pesach ela min akvasim. But the halacha is that Pesach only comes from kvasim umina'izim. Ela tzon ze Pesach. So Rabbi says, so the shaila is, how do you understand the pasuk? The Torah says you have to give a Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzon ubakar. So but yet the Pesach is only tzon, not bakar. So the Gemara says Ela tzon ze Pesach. But rather again, tzon is Pesach, bakar zu chagiga, and bakar is chagiga. Va'amar Rachmana, and the Torah says, Amar Rachmana v'zavachta Pesach. Amar Rav Ashi, so we'll say, what do you see from here? So Rav Ashi says, so again, so therefore you see Yehuda ben Dartai is essentially saying that what? Yehuda ben Dartai is saying that Lemaisa, the Tzon is Pesach, Bakar is the Karma Chagiga. And you see that they're mentioned together, and therefore Lemaisa it shows that it's obligatory just like the Pesach. Amar Rav Ashi, so Rav Ashi says, Va'anan taima de perushim neko v'nifrosh. Do we have to busy ourselves with such extremists? Meaning Yehuda ben Dartai is out of his mind. Right? Saying, so why do we have to spend any amount of time going ahead and discussing his particular shita? So the Gemara says, Ella, Kra, you know what, Phil? Let's Michael, you know what, if you don't mind, take the chair out right from your air and just right by the entrance. It's the easiest thing. So the Gemara says, Ela kra l'chid Rav Nachman huda asa. Rather, again, the pasuk is coming for the purpose of Rav Nachman. The Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravua, minayin lemosra Pesach shekarav shlamim. How do we know that lemaisa, again, the leftover Pesach is offered up as a shlamim? Shene'emar, because the pasuk says, v'zavachta Pesach la'Hashem Elokecha tzonu bakar. Now, we'll say, what does that mean? Mosar Pesach, what does that mean? What that means ultimately over here is like this, is that lemaisa, if you will say have a carbon, if you have a carbon that was set aside and then you lost that carbon, right, and then you had to offer another one, that original carbon still has the status of a carbon Pesach. So what do you do with that carbon? That carbon can be offered as a shlamim. So we'll say, or if you miss out, or the value of that particular carbon ultimately can be offered up as a shlamim. Shnei emar v'zavachta Pesach la'Hashem Elokecha tzonu bakar v'chi Pesach mina bakar ba v'halo ein Pesach ba ela mina kvasu mina izim ela moser ha-Pesach yihi el davar haba mina tzon umina bakar. Okay. V'Rabbanan mai taimelo dochi Shabbos. Ha vadai carbon sibarhu. Now, according to the Rabbanan, why is it that Chagiga is not docha Shabbos? At the end of the day, it is still considered to be a carbon sibor. Amar Rabbi Loi, Mishum Rabbi Huda ben Safra, Amar Kra, v'chagosem oso chag laHashem shivas yomim. Shivas yom bashana. So we'll say, because the Torah says, you will go ahead and celebrate. You'll go ahead and celebrate this Yom Tov for HaKadosh Baruch Hu 7 days. Shiva Shmona Havu. Rabbi say this is referring to Sukkot. Now Rabbi say Lemaisa again. Sukkot is 8 days, not 7. So why Lemaisa again? Why does it call it 7 days? Ela mikan lechagiga she'ena docha es Shabbos. But rather, what do we see from here? We see from here that carbon chagiga is not docha Shabbos. So also the fact that the Torah talks about Sukkot and only calls it 7 days and not 8 days indicates to us what? That l'maisa on Shabbos you would not bring the particular carbon. Ki asa Ravin Amar Amarti lefnei Rabo Saipamim Shiata Maltze Ela Shisha. There are times where l'maisa you'd only offer up 6 carbonos or carbonos of 6 days. When is that? Kigon shechal Yom Tov Arishon Shel Chag b'Shabbos. We'll say if the first day of Yom Tov falls on Shabbos, then what? Then l'maisa again the first day Shabbos. The 8th day is Shabbos, and on both of those days you wouldn't offer up carbonos. To which the Gemara says, Amar Abaye, Abin Tichla, Leima Kiha Milsa, Shmona Lamashkachas, La Klal, Shiva Isa Berov Shanra. Both say, interestingly enough, the Gemara says, in reality, you'll never actually find 8 days of Sukkot in which you'll offer up carbonos. Most years, you're lucky if you get 7. Some years, you'll only get 6 if the first and last days ultimately fall on Shabbos. So I'll say, we're not finished with this yet, but Lamaisa, what comes out of this is you see again, Ben Tema, Yehuda ben Dartai, taking this incredible stance that Lemaisa, again, Chagiga is totally equated with Pesach in every single respect. Again, as we saw in Amud Aleph. So according to Ben Tema, again, Chagiga resembles Pesach, Shviras Etzem, Tzli, Doches Shabbos, and Ben Dartai takes this so far that even Bemeruba, you would still go ahead and offer up the carbon chagiga. Again, seems to be based on the pasuk that the Torah seems to indicate tzon ubakar by Pesach, but yet again the Rabbanan say no. The bakar comes to teach us that if you have mosar Pesach, you have a leftover carbon or leftover carbon Pesach funds, that lemais again those would be used to go ahead and even purchase shlamim, which ultimately can come even min bakar. All right, let's stop over here.